warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable to Sigayfer and Chairman of the Zainul Hasan Genggong Education Foundation, Kiai Haji Muhammad Hasan Mutawakil Allah SHMM. Respectable to Director of Zainul Hasan Genggong University, Dr. Abdul Aziz BAMAG, and respectable to my final project supervisor, Mr. Muhammad Hifdil Islam MPD and Ms. Ririn Fatmawati MLE, who always guide us so that we can finish my thesis proposal to completion, and respectable to my beloved parents who have given us full support and the opportunity to continue our education at Zainul Hasan Genggong Islamic University. And my name is Intan Humairoh. I'm from English Education Department, Faculty of Educational Scientific and Teaching, Zainul Hasan Genggong Islamic University. Okay, in this occasion, I would like to present my final thesis proposal by using PPT under title Student Perception Toward Podcast Media in Learning English Speaking Skill at Zainul Hasan Genggong Islamic University. And for the first is chapter 1, that the content is introduction. And in the introduction, that there are 4 points that we have to know. And for the first is background of the study, and the second is statement of the problem, and the third focus and objective of the study, and the fourth significance of the study and previous study. And the first point is background of the study. In reality, English is a foreign language in many countries, including Indonesia. As people learn a foreign language, especially English, they will involve in the process of learning 4 skills, namely speaking, reading, writing, and listening. And this study is focused in the speaking. Definition of speaking. Speaking is defined as conveying the intent of one ideas, thoughts, or heard to other by using spoken language. Quote by Eustera, people who speak English well are those who can communicate fluently in everyday life. It means students in this modern era must be able to master speaking skill, which will give them the ability to communicate with the global community. To make learning fun, teacher must have a method that attracts student attention and that is a challenge for teachers. In fact, in this modern era of technology, there are many applications both offline and online that can help them learn to speak. For example, podcast. Definition of podcast. Podcast is platform for storing sound recording that can be listened to anytime and anywhere. And the reason of the research is the researcher found that students have difficulty learning to speak because they are not confident in speaking English. One of the factors is the lack of learning media when practicing speaking skill. So, in this study, students use podcast media. With this podcast, they not only listen but they can practice podcasting in the class. And for the second point is statement of the problem. In this point, there are 2 questions. And for the first question is how podcast media run as learning media in learning English speaking skill. And for the second question, how do student perception toward podcast media in learning English speaking skill. For the third point is focus and objective of the study. This research focused on teaching English speaking skill to fourth semester students majoring in English education at Zainul Hasan Genggong Islamic University. This lesson focused on student perception of using English podcast media in learning their English speaking skill. This is related to student enthusiasm for listening to podcasts and practicing them. And the main aim of this research is to find out how podcast media is used as learning media for speaking skill and student perception of the use of podcast media in learning English speaking skill. The next point is significance of the study. The significance of the study covers two purposes about theoretically and practically. For the second is practically, that covers into 3 points, and for the first is for researcher, and the second is for student, and the third is for university. Last point is preview study. Dinar Ayu Asifia in his article Students' Perspective, the Impact of Podcasts on EFL Students' Listening Comprehension. This study used qualitative describe by using questionnaire in interview. This research results showed that the majority of students in the questionnaire agreed that students help improve their listening skill because they were considered to have interesting and fun features that stimulate their enthusiasm and motivate them to continue learning. Based on the previous research described above, although all the researchers above wrote about students' perception of the use of podcast media, very few of these researchers conduct research that focus on student perception of podcast media in learning speaking skill. Most researchers focus on the use of podcasts to improve student listening skill. So, the novelty of the research is how students perceive the use of podcast media in learning English speaking skill. Apart from that, so this researcher will focus on student of English education department study program. For the next slide is the chapter 2. In the chapter 2, there are 3 important points. For the first is review of related literature, and for the second, definition of media, and the third is podcast media in learning English speaking skill. Okay, for the first is speaking. According to Richard and Renandia 2022, speaking is form of communication, and speaking is one of the key part of communication. In addition, Nunan states that mastery of the art of speaking is the single most important aspect in learning a second or foreign language, and success is measured by the ability to carry out a conversation in language teaching. So, speaking skills are important point to facilitate uh, the delivery of information directly to describe, comment, or entertain about something to others. Speak is the most important part of language learning to have face-to-face conversation. And for the second is definition of media. The word media comes from the Latin word medius, which means middle, intermediary, or introduction. According to Gachni and Bridge, learning media includes tools that are physically used to convey listen material, and media can be defined as a path that connects the recipient and the source of information message. In this, it is often seen by people who use media in everyday life, such as newspaper, online article, film, television, and more. And for the third point is podcast media in learning English speaking skill. This MT and Rector's MA state that we believe that speaking and pronunciation skill should be improved. Therefore, it is important to measure spoken language easily, and this can be done by doing duration audio recordings or podcasts. And for the next slide is about conceptual framework. The conceptual framework underlying this research can be defined in the following this picture. The description above is a conceptual framework made by researcher, which is basically what happened in general. The description showed that student ability or student speaking skill, then as the main topic, the student difficulties in speaking skill. Furthermore, learning media is a learning tool tools so that students can more easily understand what is conveyed by educator or podcast media can be used as learning tools to improve student speaking skill. And the last is student perception of the use of podcasts in learning student English speaking skill, which that improve their speaking skill. Okay, for the next slide is chapter 3. In the chapter 3, there are 5 points that we have to know. And for the first point is research design. For the second is source of data. And the third is data collection. And for the fourth is data analysis. And for the last is trustworthiness. Okay, and for the first point is research design. The method employed in this research was described research by using a qualitative approach. According to Creswell, the definition of qualitative research is the research process or examining human or social problem is based on typical or traditional research method by building a complex and holistic picture, analyzing work, reporting information and view in detail, and conducting research naturally. The participant of this research is fourth semester of the English Education Department study program. The reason I choose this location is because I have made a direct observation at the location. Then I conduct interview with several students and I also observe the surrounding condition and situation. And the result of my interview with some of the students showed that these fourth semester students are used to using English when learning take place. This fourth semester English education student use learning media through podcast in very effective way, namely native speaker imitate voice. From this method, they can practice their speaking skill and develop confidence when dealing with other and communicating with other using English. For the second point is source of data. This research is used primary data and secondary data. For the third point is data collection. And this research used three. For the first is observation, and the second is interview, and the last is documentation. For the next slide is there are 4 point and last point. And for the fourth point is data analysis. There are data collection, data reduction, data display, and conclusion and verification. And for the last point is trustworthiness. There is triangulation and participate observation. Based on the information previously described, researcher will try to obtain data through several documents, namely interview transcript, photos, and other important documents as evidence that researchers have carried out research action. Denzim suggests that triangulation is divided into four components. So that is a technique that can check the validity of the information or data. Okay, I think enough for my presentation today, and I apologize if I have many mistakes. And thank you very much for your nice attention. The last we say, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.